Burnt Offering. Written by Ryan Harville. Performed by Drew Blood. The sun was settling among the tops of the tall pines lining the highway when the dispatcher's voice came over the radio.
All units, we have a call for a domestic disturbance over at Ed Rayford's place. Anybody available?
Andy took one hand off the wheel, grabbed the radio, and thumbed the call button in one practiced gesture.
Dispatch, this is Deputy Powell. I'm heading that way. Be there in 5, Cherie.
There was a slight crackle over the air. Then Sherry's voice became clear.
Thanks, Andy. I'd put the lights on if I were you. Sadie Rayford sounded pretty bad off.
Understood, Andy said, flipping the switch. The siren came to life, warbling as Andy pressed harder on the accelerator. The engine roared to life and the patrol car was eating blacktop, heading due east towards the Rayford farm along the Alabama back roads. His mind turned to Ed Rayford. He was a church deacon, coached his boys' Little League baseball team, never had so much as a speeding violation. What could have his wife so spooked? There were plenty of idiots in the county who had a habit of hitting women, but Ed? No, Andy couldn't believe it. The road to Rayford's farm came up on his left. Andy hit the brakes and slid into the turn, kicking up dust and a rooster tail behind the car. The gravel crunched and popped beneath the patrol car's tires as he approached the house. He stopped the car in the driveway and threw the gear shift into park. Nothing moved in the house. He'd half expected to see Sadie run out the front door, or even Ed himself stepping out with a sheepish grin on his face. Wife-beaters almost always had that grin, a smile that said, well, shucks, I guess things did get a little out of hand. But he couldn't imagine that grin on Ed's face. He wouldn't believe it until he saw it. Andy got out of the car and closed the door behind him, the smell of dirt and gasoline and cut grass all around him. He hadn't even taken a step when he heard screams coming from behind the house. He ran, flicking the leather strap off the top of his sidearm as he went. When he reached the corner of the house, he paused, his hand on the butt of his sidearm. He slowly turned the corner. Sadie was on her knees in the dirt, her arms stretched out before her.
Please, Ed, don't do this.
Ed Rayford stood halfway between Sadie and his old barn. His thinning hair was slick with sweat, gleaming in the orange light cast from the lit torch he held aloft in one hand. It was little more than a stick wrapped in oily rags.
Ed?
Andy called.
Ed, what in the hell's going on here?
Ed looked at him, squinting against the fire's light.
Deputy Powell? Is that you?
Yeah, Ed, it's me. We got a call about a disturbance. Just want to make sure everything's all right.
Damn it, Sadie!
Ed cried.
I told you not to call anybody!
Sadie shook her head, making tears roll further down her cheeks.
You need help, Ed.
That's all I want to do, Ed.
Andy said.
I just want to help.
Ed surveyed him.
How old are you, Deputy?
I just turned 30.
Andy said, confused by the question. The other man nodded.
I'll be 52 this year, but I got a boy not even half your age. Crazy, ain't it? We'd given up on having kids, and then out of nowhere we were blessed.
Andy nodded.
I know it. I've seen Easton play ball. That boy's got an arm on him.
He sure does. Don't know where he gets it from. I never dreamed he'd be so talented. I don't have an athletic bone in my body.
I'm sure...
Andy began, but he was quickly cut off.
Do you ever dream, Deputy?
Ed asked.
Well, sure,
Andy said, looking from Ed to Sadie and then back again.
I guess everyone does.
Ed looked at the torch, its flames bright in the waning evening light.
I never did, or never remembered. But I've been having these dreams, Deputy. These beautiful, terrible dreams.
Sadie began to cry.
Please, Ed. Please don't.
I dreamed I was high on a mountain.
Ed continued.
And it was cold, and the wind swept over me, threatening to topple me off. But then I saw him.
Who?
Andy asked.
God,
He said.
the clouds didn't so much as part as they just dissolved into a haze. And he was there, floating above me, his features like fire. I half expected to go blind.
Andy slowly nodded.
Okay, but what's that got to do with this, Ed?
Ed smiled, his eyes red and watery.
Everything. The Lord called down to me. Edward, he said. And I called back to him. I'm here, Lord. And he told me not to be afraid, that it was a sacred mountaintop, the mountain of Abraham, and I wouldn't be hurt.
The words coalesced in Andy's mind, coming together and forming a terrible idea. Ed continued.
He spoke of Isaac, that he was blameless.
Andy let Ed's words fade into the background. All the Sundays he spent as a kid holed up in one of the Bible study classrooms at church came flooding back to him. Andy reached up to his shoulder and thumbed the button on the radio. "Dispatch," he said softly. "It's Deputy Powell. I need backup at the Rayford farm as quick as you can. Get the fire department too."
Everything all right, Andy?
Cherie said. Her voice sounded a million miles away.
No time, Cherie. Just get them here quick.
Ed kept on.
But not all the blameless, although they may look it. Some are devils.
Ed,
Andy said with as much authority as he could muster.
where's your boy right now? Where's Easton?
Sadie let out a loud sob and hugged herself as she rocked back and forth.
He's tied up in the barn.
She said, choking on the words. Andy looked at the old barn. It was weathered gray, the planks old and splintered, and not much bigger than a two-car garage. Out from beneath its wide double doors was a dark, muddy line leading all the way back to Ed.
Shit.
Andy said breathlessly.
Shit, Ed, what have you done? Is the boy hurt?
Ed wheeled toward him.
Easton is not in the barn, Deputy. Whatever it is just wearing his skin.
Andy drew his sidearm from his holster. He pointed it not quite toward Ed, but not at the ground either.
Ed, now you listen to me.
Andy said, trying his damnedest to keep his voice calm.
You walk to me, okay? You walk to me, and we're gonna douse that torch and have ourselves a talk. Nobody's been hurt yet, so we can turn this whole thing around. Let's just talk this over, okay?
Ed was shaking his head before Andy had even finished his first sentence.
Can't do that, Deputy. I'm sorry. I ain't trying to be difficult, and I know you got a job to do. But when it comes down to what you want and what God wants, well, I think you know the answer.
You can't do this, Ed, and you know deep down that this is wrong.
Andy said.
I'll talk to the boy and see what's going on. Just let me help, or you do something you're going to regret.
Ed looked to the gasoline-soaked ground and shook his head.
No time for talking. God was very specific. When the sun dips below the horizon, it will be time to cleanse the evil. Cleanse it with fire.
Andy squinted up at the treetops. Sundown couldn't be more than 5 or 6 minutes off. He had to act. Andy aimed the pistol at Ed, right at center mass.
Come forward and drop the torch, Ed. I don't want to hurt you, but I'm not about to let you hurt Easton either.
That thing is not Easton. Easton is gone. I don't know for how long. Maybe weeks, maybe months. But whatever is wearing his face is not my son. God told me, he told me, that there was a demon in the boy's body, crawling around, and using my only son like a puppet. But that's not all he told me. He said Easton's soul was already in heaven.
Tears ran down Ed's face and into his beard.
And my boy is in paradise, Deputy, sitting at a big table with his grandma and all the rest of the long-gone Rayfords. All that's left, tied up in the barn, is evil meat.
Andy switched the pistol safety off and placed his finger over the trigger.
I'll do it. Ed, I swear I will.
Ed eyed him.
You can shoot me if you think you have to, but when I hit the ground, so does the torch.
Andy was still as stone. Sweat dripped down into one eye, and he fought the urge to blink. The sun was getting lower, staining the sky purple.
No more warnings,
Andy repeated.
Bring the torch over here or I will shoot you down.
Ed smiled.
Guess this is goodbye then, Deputy. I am truly sorry you had to get mixed up in there.
He lowered the torch. Before Andy could react, Sadie was on her feet, screaming and sprinting at Ed. She collided with him, knocking the breath from his lungs and slamming them both to the ground. The torch went flying, up and away from the gas. The two of them fought, Ed pulling her hair and kicking, trying to free himself as his other hand was groping, but the torch was way out of his reach. Andy froze. He couldn't take the shot, not with the two of them tumbling around.
Andy! Get Easton! Hurry!
That broke his stupor. He ran, his feet squelching in the gas-soaked mud. He reached the door and swung it open, the rusted hinges squealing from disuse. In the gloom of the barn stood Easton, his mouth gagged and his hands tied to one of the barn's thick support posts. He saw Andy and made a muffled cry. He ran behind the column and tugged at the expertly tied knots.
Hold on, Easton,
he said. He holstered his gun and drew a small pocket knife from his belt. He flipped it open and began to saw at the rope. Outside, Sadie screamed. The last of the fibers split beneath the blade and Easton was free.
Come on,
Andy cried, pulling Easton's hand and leading him out.
We gotta help your mom.
They emerged from the barn and into the dying light. Ed was straddling Sadie, his hands pinning her wrist to the ground. Andy drew his pistol once more and took aim.
Get off her, Ed.
Andy cried.
Now!
Ed looked at him, then let Sadie go. He rolled off her and then sat on the ground. Andy watched the man's eyes as they darted to where the torch lay sputtering.
Don't make me do it, Ed,
Andy said.
Not in front of your family. Please.
Andy walked a wide circle around Ed, leading Easton with his free hand.
Sadie, you all right?
Sadie nodded.
Just need to catch my breath.
Well, Andy said.
I'd feel a lot better if you'd get away from that gasoline.
He turned to Ed.
Don't so much as twitch now.
He was so focused on Ed that he didn't feel Easton let go of his hand.
You're making a mistake,
Ed pleaded.
You don't know?
You thought you had me, didn't you? Easton asked, his voice far deeper than it had any right to be. But I'm no Isaac, no Lamb. I'm smarter and far older than you can imagine. Andy looked at Easton. He stood defiant, the gag now loose and hanging around his neck. He held the torch out in front of him, its light creating stark shadows on his features.
Deputy,
Ed whimpered.
Don't listen to him. You have to.
Too late, the boy said, and tossed the torch into Ed's lap. Andy fell back as the heat from the flames blasted over him. He landed hard on his ass, then scrabbled away from the fire. Ed was engulfed in flame, his skin blackening, but he still reached for Easton. He stumbled, falling into Sadie, and spreading the fire over her as well. The couple's screams rose together in concert, traveling up with the greasy smoke. Andy's mouth hung open, the heat drying his tongue as he watched them flail, then collapse. Easton smiled, the firelight dancing in the dark pools of his eyes. Guess I'll be off now, Deputy. I appreciate the assistance, but if I were you, I wouldn't try to follow me. The boy walked past him.
Stop!
Andy cried and raised his pistol. Easton looked back over his shoulder. What?
Are you going to shoot a defenseless orphan? No, I don't think you will. This is going to be hard enough to explain, isn't it?
The thing continued walking, and within moments, it had disappeared into the dark. Andy sat back, lowering the pistol with one shaking hand. The fire had reached the barn, and the old wood went up quickly. He watched the flames as they danced, watched them throw up sparks like fireflies. He was still watching them when his backup arrived, their strobing flashers staining the world with blue. They would have questions, and those questions would lead nowhere, because Andy had no idea what in the hell just happened.